Good morning. Welcome everyone to our annual What's Next Summit. We are so excited to be bringing you some of the top minds across topics like energy, the future of technology, what's next for cities, finance, and more. When we were thinking about who would be one of the best voices to bring to you to talk about emerging technology trends, we couldn't help but think about streaming, of course. And I absolutely love that video because it ends on the smart home. I'm here today to introduce you to one of the top minds in streaming. So without further ado, please welcome me in introducing Cesar Conde, the chair of NBC News Group.
Thank you. Sarah, how are you?
Hey, I'm great. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I wanted to start off, since we're kicking off the conference, with news of the day. Last week, Axios reported that MSNBC is in exclusive talks with White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki about potentially bringing her on, giving her a streaming show, and then also having her on as programming. Do you have any comment about the report?
Well, first of all, great to see you, Sarah. Thank you so much for the invitation. Congratulations to Jim, Mike, wherever you are, and the entire Axios team on the launch of this new event. We're very excited for you. I did see those reports over the weekend, including the report from Axios, and I don't have anything to add beyond what's in the reports.
Beyond that particular report, MSNBC also has a contract with Symone Sanders, the former chief spokesperson for Vice President Kamala Harris. She has a streaming show. She appears on MSNBC programming. It seems like this is becoming a trend where MSNBC is bringing in sort of a revolving door of Biden administration officials. Do you worry about how that impacts MSNBC's credibility?
I think the great thing about all these emerging new platforms that we're seeing in the media ecosystem, streaming being one of the primary ones today, I think what that has allowed us and allowed other media companies is to begin to bring in a variety of different voices and perspectives. We have more places to have individuals. And so in our particular case in the past, what we've done is we've tried to bring in a variety of different individuals who bring unique perspectives. We've brought in journalists like Tom Llamas for our primary NBC News streaming platform. We've brought in Symone, as you said, a political contributor. We've brought in Joshua Johnson from the radio space, Katie Fang, one of the great legal minds. So we'll continue to do that because we think that it allows us to tap into brand new audiences, and hopefully that'll help bring audiences to our overall portfolio.
When I was reporting out that report on Jen Psaki, one of the things I noted was that because you have a lot of streaming platforms, you're able to give some of these talents their own shows, or some of these officials their own shows. Is that going to be the new norm, that people walk in the door and they expect to have their own streaming show? Or do you think that it's just going to continue to be sort of like linear TV, where it's still a prized possession?
Look, I think, again, the ecosystem that's developing in the digital space, we're seeing so many of these new platforms. It just provides more space. Streaming is one of them. Audio and podcast is another place that we are seeing a tremendous amount of audience move towards. And so we have much more real estate in this day and age than we did in the old days, where we just had a grid during the day and a few hours in the morning and a few hours at night. I don't want to say that we have an infinite amount of inventory, but we have a lot more inventory. And we think that's great for audiences because they'll be able to tap into new people that may be of interest to them. And that's hopefully something we'll be able to contribute to over time.
So while we're on that topic, Rachel Maddow, who has for many years hosted your 9 p.m. hour on MSNBC, sure, the highest rated hour on the network, has renegotiated a contract to expand her portfolio. She's going to be doing documentaries and podcasts. Are those the types of conversations that you're having with staff across the board from TV? They want to get into this other stuff?
So Rachel is a great example of someone that's going to be with us for so many years. And it's a great example of our distribution, our digital approach has at the center of it what we call our omni-channel strategy. And what do I mean by that? It means we want to make sure that we have our content being distributed to our audiences on all of the platforms in all of the places that they're choosing to consume their information and their news. And so when you think of someone like Rachel, who has a large, engaged following that wants to hear more from her, we're in the great situation where we can have someone like her contribute on our cable network and we can have her also now begin to be part of our streaming platform, and we can have her build content for podcasts or audio, and she can build long form or documentary type information for topics that require or merit deeper investigative work. And so that's one great example. We're doing that with a lot of talent. Jim Cramer from CNBC is someone we're expanding to the direct-to-consumer space. Andrew Ross Sorkin, one of our great talent at CNBC, is now been tapped to do a long-form show on NBC News Now. So we can do it just not with talent, we can do it with brands. In our particular case at NBC News, we have the Today Show. And so people think of the Today Show as the morning show. But the Today Show, in many ways, has evolved over the years to be almost like a lifestyle brand. And so we touch a number of topics. Yes, we touch news, but we touch lifestyle, entertainment, home, family, health issues. And so we're able to now take, with this omni-channel approach, we're able to take something like the Today Show and expand it into streaming, where we now have Today All Day, which is a 24/7 streaming platform around today and many of these topics. We're able to have our talent, like Hoda Kotb, launch a phenomenal podcast. One of our other talent on the Today Show, Jenna Hager-Bush, has a book club. So it allows us to play in a lot of different places. And so we think that is certainly one of the directions where the industry's going. And so it's a place where talent and brands and franchises, they matter more in an omni-channel ecosystem. And we think, look, this is a win for our talent and brands because they have access to broader audiences. We think it's a win for our audiences because they can get more of the people and the brands that they love. And it's a win for us as well.
I know you probably can't address it, but I have to ask.
Sure. While
we're on the topic of Rachel Maddow, do you have any sense of who's going to be replacing her at that 9 p.m. hour? Any hints you could give us?
Rachel's going to be with us for a long time, and we're going to see more of Rachel, not less.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's talk about the talent. You know, journalists, they require a lot of time to do research and to make calls. Do you ever worry about spreading certain people, not brands, but spreading people too thin if you're assigning them all of these different types of things across the platform?
Look, we have incredible journalists who have tremendous bandwidth, and so clearly ensuring that we're resourcing our teams in the proper way to make sure that we're feeding all of these different platforms in the proper way is absolutely something that's top of mind for us. But at the end of the day, I think, and hopefully you would agree with this, I think our team of journalists love the ability to be able to reach audiences on so many more platforms. And so yes, there's a little bit more that they need to do, but that requires us really on the corporate side to ensure that we're giving as much resources as we can to all of the emerging platforms.
Speaking of the corporate side, for those of you who don't know, Cesar runs a news division across NBC, which includes NBC News, MSNBC, and CNBC. So how many people are within that whole entire news group?
We have a little over 3,000 plus folks in our news organization.
Globally?
Yes.
And I want to talk to you about the biggest story that all of them, all 3,000 of them, are really focused on right now, which is Ukraine. You all have folks on the ground in Europe. Walk me through how you're thinking about that in terms of safety and also in terms of the content that you're providing for your viewers. What are they expecting?
Yeah, so, you know, the reports that we're seeing out of the Ukraine, even since yesterday, are horrific. You know, when this crisis in Ukraine started a few weeks ago, I think the first thing that came to mind for me was that it was a reminder of how fortunate we are to live here in the United States. As we've witnessed millions of Ukrainians leave their democratic society out of fear of being ruled by an autocratic society. Those events have personal resonance for me, as I think they have for so many people around the world. My mom left Cuba in the early 1960s when Fidel Castro was tightening his grip on that island country. And my two younger brothers and I were born here in the United States, and we grew up in Miami among a diaspora that understood firsthand what an important role a free press played in a democratic society, and they understood that that's something that could be lost. It could be lost as quickly as within a generation. And so growing up, I grew up with a very deep respect and understanding for the role of journalism in a democracy. And so these events are very personal for me, as I know they are for many others. As it relates to Ukraine, I think there's a number of dynamics, as we all know. We have the military confrontation, of course. We have the humanitarian crisis that continues to evolve and is heartbreaking. And of course, the broader geopolitical ramifications. So as we look at all of those different issues, we look at them through a variety of different lenses. So for example, we look at them through the lens of the Russia-Ukraine relationship. Certainly the short-term change in their relationship, but more importantly, where does that go in the long term? And something that's become painfully obvious to all of us over the last few weeks is that this is going to be a crisis that's going to go for a long time. So we are preparing for the long haul. And so, that's something that is extraordinarily important for us to make sure that we think through what is that situation on the ground there.
Obviously, the war has been a boon for engagement with audiences. This is something they really care about. Ratings are up. Is there a concern that once audiences stop engaging to the same extent that they were at the beginning of the war, there's not going to be as much of a commercial incentive to keep driving that coverage?
No, I think this is an incredibly important issue. I think people realize that this is having geopolitical ramifications. We talked about the Russia-Ukraine lens that we're looking at this through. I think it's also important we're looking at this through the United States and NATO alliance lens. The alliance, clearly at the beginning of this crisis, has stayed very strong and unified. As this crisis emerges, we want to make sure that we're watching to see, does that alliance strengthen? Does that alliance show any cracks? And I think another lens that people are increasingly talking about is the role of China. We saw some of this coverage early on in the crisis. We think going forward, this is going to be an important part of the crisis. But I think to your question, I think on the ground reporting, the reason I think this is important for our audiences and for the world is it is not lost on us that this war in Ukraine is almost it's like a prism into the state of journalism today. In many ways, we're seeing the bravery and the courage of our incredible journalists and so many of our peers in journalism as well, who are on the ground in harm's way. And this is a very, very different war than what we've seen recently. And that's caused us to revisit some of our assumptions as far as preparation. I would tell you a quick example. From a security perspective, in the more recent crises we've seen overseas, our preparations for security of our teams usually is based on the assumption that we have some proximity to U.S. military presence. That is not the case in Ukraine. And so that has forced us to be much more focused and thoughtful as it relates to preparations of security. I think another dynamic we're dealing with is the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing in our society. We're seeing in the microcosm of Ukraine from a number of different fronts. At the beginning of this crisis, we were receiving a lot of information, footage, video and the like from social media as well as individuals on the ground. And we have an entire social media team dedicated to just vetting and ensuring that the information that we're putting out is verified. At the beginning of this crisis, in the first few days, the overwhelming majority of the information that we were receiving, 7, 8 out of 10 of the videos, were fake or doctored.
Wow.
And so, in many ways, what we were receiving was counterfeit news, right? It's, someone was, like in any counterfeit situation, someone had created or recreated something that was very valuable, but with the intent to deceive or defraud. And so, this topic is taking up much more bandwidth and resources from us than in a regular situation. And I'd say maybe the last dynamic we're dealing with is this proliferation of places where audiences in the region, here in the United States or overseas, the places that they're getting their news. They're getting more news, they're getting their news faster, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting better news. And so ensuring that it's real and it's accurate is fundamental. So for us at the news group, what we're focused on is really taking the incredible work of our courageous journalists on the ground. How do we decipher fact from fiction? And then ensure we disseminate it across all these emerging platforms. In our particular case, across our broadcast TV networks in English and Spanish. our cable networks, our digital, social, mobile platforms, and of course, our emerging streaming platforms as well.
There's been a huge push, not just in terms of how you're managing this from sort of a business and resources side, but a content push at NBC to cover misinformation. I've noticed that you've hired a lot more internet culture reporters, people who dive into this specifically. Is that one area that you're going to continue to go deeper on? What are other areas of content that you guys are going to go bigger on?
Let me address this misinformation and disinformation, because I think this is important. When you look at the state of journalism right now, I would say from a macro perspective, I think what's been reinforced over the last few years is the vital and important role that a strong and independent media plays in a democracy, here in the United States as well as overseas. And so that's from a macro perspective. I think we have some real strengths in our industry right now. And one thing I would point out as an example is what's been seen over the last 2 years is that covering increasingly complex issues like the pandemic, like the economic crisis, like social justice, leading all the way up to the war in Ukraine. Covering those complex issues requires extraordinary expertise by our journalists to ensure we're covering these issues correctly. It requires extraordinary resources to ensure that we're covering them comprehensively. And in many cases, it requires extraordinary courage for our journalists to be on the ground and authentically talk about these issues. And so in many ways, we all like to think news has always been important. It feels that news is more consequential at this moment in time. And in many ways, we like to say that in our media industry, our journalists and our news teams are our version of first responders. They have never stopped working. They have never stopped going towards the crisis, towards the fire. And so we're very proud of that. So I think the core of the character of our journalism industry is strong. At the same time, to your question on misinformation and disinformation, I think we're dealing with a fundamental challenge, and that is trust in our institutions here in the United States, including the news media. And so we believe passionately that this is a topic that we all have to do our part. There's no silver bullet to solving it, and it's not something that'll happen overnight. In our particular case, we're trying to do a few things because we think it's important to be proactive around this topic. You know, clearly, an area of focus for us is our overarching mission: focus on facts, accuracy, holding those in power accountable, holding ourselves accountable to make sure that we get things right. But I think there are some other tactics that we are trying to implement to address this issue of trust and misinformation. First is we are big believers that newsrooms have to represent all of the communities that we are serving here in the United States. And so what does that mean? We think our newsrooms have to have diversity of gender, diversity of ethnicity, diversity of geography, diversity of socioeconomic backgrounds, diversity of experiences, perspectives, and the like. We think that helps us serve our audiences better and reach broader audiences. We think ensuring that we have, yes, there's going to be increasing subscription services coming out of news organizations such as ourselves, such as you all. But we think it's equally important to offer free access to world-class journalism from news organizations that have high, rigorous standards to the broader population. If we don't do that, we run the risk that over time, large portions of the population who may not be able to afford subscription services may be left with only what's out there in social media, and worse, some of the misinformation and disinformation that's out there. I would say a last thing that we are trying to really lean into is we are trying to utilize the very same technologies and platforms that have been used over the last few years to disseminate misinformation and disinformation. We believe we have to use those very same platforms to disseminate world-class journalism with high standards, hopefully trying to reach some of those audiences. So none of these are a silver bullet, and none of this will happen overnight, but we all have to focus on what we can control.
And those platforms, I'm assuming, are Facebook and TikTok and all of that?
Absolutely, all of those emerging platforms.
Wanted to follow up with you on the topic of diversity, equity, inclusion. You have a stated goal that you want NBC to reach 50% of your staff as women, 50% multicultural, but you have never said when you want to hit that goal. Like, where does that stand, and when should we expect to see that you hit that?
Sure. So as a little bit of context for everyone, in the last census, I hope everyone saw, in 2020, the United States hit an important milestone. For the first time, people under the age of 18 who were also people of color crossed the 50% threshold of the population. The overall US population will cross that 50% threshold as well in the coming years. So when we saw that data, we had a choice. We could either be a future-focused organization, or we could be an organization that let change happen to us and then tried to catch up. We chose the former. And so with that in mind, we did launch the 50% Challenge Initiative with that aspiration that over time, 1 out of every 2 of our news team members would be women, 1 out of every 2 would be people of color. We are not putting a timeline on it because we want to make sure that we have sustainable and systemic change over time. We are about to hit the 2-year mark this summer. We had great progress in the first year, and our goal is to ensure that we're moving the needle every single year, but doing it in a thoughtful manner throughout that. We think that, yes, this is the right thing to do, but we also actually think this is the right thing to do for our businesses. To touch a little bit on the topic before, this will allow us to tap into new audiences. It'll allow us to touch topics and issues that are on the minds of our audiences in a more authentic way than we would otherwise.
I want to push back on something. The news media industry has traditionally lagged in terms of diversity, in part because there's been a lack of accountability. So many of these companies have been privately owned, and so they haven't had to report out data about diversity and equity and inclusion within their companies. So how can we hold NBC accountable to that goal if we don't know when the end date is, if we're not reporting out metrics?
Sure. So it's a very fair question, and the way we addressed it is we leaned into transparency. So when we announced the 50% initiative, we opened our record on this. So we announced publicly that at the time we were at 27.5% of our teams were people of color, and we've committed to every year give the results and the progress, and that is what we did last year when we hit the 1-year mark. And we went a step further. We broke it down by ethnicity, how we were doing in each one. So I think the answer to the question is transparency. And we're going to hold ourselves accountable, and we're holding ourselves accountable publicly. And so we think that's an important thing to do, and we hope others in the industry will continue to do their part.
I hope so too. As we think about this conference, thinking about trending tech, I want to pick your brain about streaming specifically. So NBC News Group has a few streaming services. All of them are free and ad-supported. First of all, I know you said that free was important because it keeps things widely accessible, but can you walk me through the decision not to put things behind a paywall? And I'd love your thoughts on CNN's decision to put theirs behind a paywall.
Sure. So as we were looking at the evolving nature of our media space, clearly consumption patterns started to shift over the last few years. The pandemic didn't change consumption patterns, it just accelerated trends that we were already seeing. And there's probably 2 fundamental things that are driving change in our industry. One is demographic change, which we touched on a little bit. And we've made big investments there and have prioritized that. The second is technology has changed consumption patterns, and this is the other area of investment for us. Streaming is where people are moving as far as consumption. So over the last few years, the habits of consumers in streaming as it relates to entertainment content have been pretty much set. We all know Netflix, Disney+, Peacock, which is our NBC Universal streaming service, the HBO Maxes, Hulus, Plutos, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at the consumption patterns of audiences as it relates to news in streaming, those habits are just recently starting to be formed. So that's why a couple of years ago we moved so aggressively to invest in the streaming ecosystem. And so our first investment was to strengthen and launch our NBC News Now streaming platform that you alluded to. It is our 24/7 news offering. It is hard news, breaking news, general news, no perspective. available, broadly distributed, as you alluded to, Sarah. We also believe that, that ensuring that our audiences have access to that world-class journalism is important for the reasons we talked about before. As it relates to your question about free versus subscription, in our particular case, we anchored our investment around NBC News Now. We then launched Today All Day, which is our 24/7 streaming network around the Today franchise, and that is also off to a great start for us. But we also felt that it was important to bring some of our content around MSNBC, and we just announced recently that we're going to be putting MSNBC on Peacock. And to be specific, that will be behind the Peacock paywall. And so in our particular case, we think it's important to offer that variety to our audiences of both free as well as subscription.
You came from Telemundo prior to this role. Where does the news from Telemundo fit into this whole atmosphere?
Sure. Well, you know, Telemundo has an incredible history of journalism on a variety of fronts, and it is part of our NBC Universal group. There's a tremendous amount of collaboration. I loved my time at Telemundo and at Spanish language media overall. It was an incredible experience, and it helped me in so many ways in this role. I'd say, you know, the fact that it gave me a front row seat for so many years to the demographic tsunami that the Latino community is here in the United States. It is driving the large majority of our population growth over the last decade here in the United States, particularly with the younger demographics as it skews so young. We dubbed it at the time at Telemundo the 3M generation. It's a generation that's millennial, it's a generation that's multicultural, and it's a generation that's mobile. And so that understanding the tastes, the habits of that audience has certainly helped inform my experience in the news group as it relates to developing new services, attracting younger audiences, and the like. I think Telemundo's news experience was also great because, yes, we covered events and news here in the United States, but we also covered a big proportion of our time with news outside of the United States. So before we had the war in Ukraine, over the last year or so, we had a crisis in Venezuela, we had a crisis in Cuba, we've had complex events in Mexico and Peru and the like. And so the experience of covering issues in markets outside of the United States where it is complex for journalists, Western journalists, to operate has been a good experience. In addition to, you know, understanding security concerns, I think the other great experience about Telemundo for me is that it's been a reminder that great talent can come from all corners of an industry. And so in our case, we are tapping into the bilingual talent that we have at Telemundo in front and behind the camera to help us at the news group tap into new audiences and appeal to new audiences in English language. And so that's been a great collaboration for us.
Jose Diaz-Balart coming into MSNBC. But I guess my follow-up question to you on that is, why doesn't Telemundo have, you know, its own type of news streaming service? Is that something you're ever thinking about?
Yeah, we think there's a tremendous hunger for news in the Hispanic media space, in the Spanish language space. And so Telemundo will continue to invest and diversify into all of these emerging platforms.
Speaking of the emerging platforms, one of the core struggles for people like you who have to manage linear TV networks as well as digital opportunities is, how do you measure success? You know, in the linear TV world, we know ratings matter. In digital, everybody has a different measurement platform. Everybody has a different metric of success. How are you thinking about measuring success in digital as it compares to TV?
Yeah, this is an emerging topic and something that I think will be refined over time. But to your point, you know, clearly in the linear space, we have more specific metrics that have been followed for years. Not that that is less important, but it's becoming less important. I think reach on the digital front is important. I think engagement levels, how passionate are our audiences about the content that they're seeing in digital, is something we can track a lot better. And I think the ability to attract broader and diverse audiences is fundamental. On that last point, the launch of NBC News Now, we talk about it from an editorial perspective, maybe from a business diversification perspective, but one of the things that it's been so fundamental for us with the NBC News Now experience, in traditional linear television, for any news outlet, news broadcast, cable news networks, the average age of viewer is 60 plus years old. For us on our NBC News streaming platform, the average age is about 35 to 40 years old. So it's not 18 years old, but for us to be able to have launched a new platform at scale, which is growing exponentially, that is now a generation younger, is a big step forward for us. And so that's another way that we're thinking of our success and measuring our performance.
And how should I be thinking about measuring your success as a reporter? Do you have metrics around, obviously because it's not paid, it's not really people that subscribe to the service. So how do you quantify how many people are either engaging with the service or how many people it's reaching?
On the streaming front, you're saying? Yeah, no, I mean, we have metrics, we have monthly.
Like what are they?
Monthly viewers, monthly visitors, making sure that, there's a certain amount of time that they're spending. But on the free basis, that's the way we're doing it. On the subscription basis, going forward, once we launch MSNBC, obviously looking at the number of subscribers that we are contributing to Peacock will be a metric as well.
And do you have like a number of monthlies for NBC News Now or any of those?
Not off the top of my mind, but something we can get you. But it's in the tens of millions of people that are visiting on a monthly basis.
When it comes to the job that you do, it's overseeing all of these different things, and it's overseeing 3,000 people. My last question quickly before we wrap up, what is NBC News' return to office plan? How are you guys managing it? How are you thinking about it?
Yeah, return to office, I think, obviously has been a top of mind topic for all of us. The last 2 years have been extraordinarily challenging for all of us as organizations, very challenging for all of us as individuals. And so as it relates to return to office, I think the last 2 years we've learned a tremendous amount. I'd say what are new things that we've learned that we will be applying? Clearly a hybrid, flexible work environment is a net positive. We think this is great for work-life balance, and this will be an ongoing part of our culture. I think a second thing we've learned is there are certain technologies that are available to us that we weren't maximizing before. Take something like CNBC. In the old days, we used to just assume every guest had to come into the New York studio or DC or one of the bureaus. We were forced for a long time to do it via video. And what it's allowed us to do is bring in speakers, guests that from different parts of the country that maybe we wouldn't have had the opportunity to bring in. So that's been fantastic. That will be something that we do going forward and a lesson learned. At the same time, I think the last 2 years have reminded us of certain things that we need to get back. The first thing is I think it reminds us that there is power in proximity. For us in the news industry, ensuring that our journalists have the ability to go out and physically be on the ground to cover a story is fundamental. And so the analogy for us, I think, in the office is in an environment, in a newsroom where creativity, collaboration, and engagement is so fundamental, we are stronger together. And so the power of proximity is very, very clear in our heads and something we want to recreate. And I'd say the last thing that's on our minds, Sarah, as it relates to return to office, is the young members of our teams. We've had hundreds of people join our news group since the pandemic started who have never set foot in our office, who have never been exposed to our culture in our newsroom. Ensuring that those individuals, just like we all did early in our careers, how did we learn? We learned through observation, through osmosis, through volunteering, through being mentored by our senior colleagues. That has not happened in the same manner, and we are concerned that that's not a good thing for our young team members in their development of their careers. It's not good for us as an industry, so that's something that's top of mind for us as well.
I know I definitely feel that way about making sure I have that power of proximity. Cesar, thank you so much for taking the time today. Some of the things that you mentioned, I love that you dropped the names Jim Cramer and Sorkin. Reminder that CNBC has some of these cross-platform personalities too, not just Maddow. I thought it was interesting that you said 70 to 80% of the videos coming in about the war at the beginning were actually misinformation that you all had to vet. Super interesting what you were saying, that it's important to think about this crisis as being something that's long-term and
Yeah.
that we're going to be going through for many years. I love the 3 M's of the multicultural, millennial, and mobile audience from Telemundo. That is a reflection of the streaming audience today. Tens of millions of people watching news across your streaming platforms. And you know, at Axios, we like to end all of our newsletters on one fun thing. So I have just a quick one fun thing for you. What's one show across all of your platforms that isn't getting enough attention that we should check out?
Yellowstone. If you haven't checked out Yellowstone on Peacock,
But Bob Backus isn't going to want to take that back?
no comment.
Cesar Conde, chair of NBC News Group, thank you so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you.